To say that this teak table was in rough shape is definitely an understatement. It's been a little while since I've done something quite this bad. There is a lot going on here, there's a lot to fix. But the first thing I had to fix was actually the mildew on it. I had to spray it down and wipe it clean before I could even put it in my car because I didn't want to get that anywhere inside my vehicle. But I got it home and now it's time to really have a good look at what I'm dealing with. This is your pretty typical solid teak mixed with veneer. We've got solid teak around the edge, mahogany veneer on the underside, solid teak legs, and of course the top is a teak veneer. This is the leaf. Doesn't look like it's had a lot of use, but you can see there's some scratching here. I'm not really sure what caused that. We've got water staining rings, what looks like it could have been a bleach or some sort of solvent stain, scratches, dings. Stay tuned. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. Okay, so I have 4 teak chairs. Now these did not come with this table. These I've had in storage for quite a while. Aside from the obvious damage here to the vinyl, I think this is electrical tape, there is significant damage to pretty much every joint on every chair that someone has horrendously tried to repair. Aside from putting these mending plates, some chairs have screws driven into the back of them, which are not original. And despite all of this, they're still wobbly. Of course, it's not a proper fix. I'm not going to cover the chairs in this video, and I'm not 100% sure if I want to sell them with this table, but they are going to be in an upcoming video. They're going to be pretty difficult, so wish me luck on that. So, as with any furniture project, I'm going to start by taking everything apart. Now, for some people, this part isn't necessary. I'm taking all of this off because I like to refinish the bottoms. Usually it's just a matter of a light sanding and sealing. You can see that the manufacturer almost never seals the bottom of furniture, but I like to. Especially on a dining room table. It helps seal the underside from any spills that might drip over the side and kind of up underneath. And it just looks so much nicer. Now I'm just doing a couple of test scrapes here to kind of see what finish I'm dealing with. This leaf hasn't seen as much use as the rest of the table, which is very common in dining room tables. I do believe this is the original finish, although it's not super thick, so it's definitely not conversion varnish. It might be like a Danish oil. So I'm going to be checking all the joints to make sure everything is tight, and as you can see, this edge bending here is loose, and it was loose on pretty much every section that there was edge bending. But here you can actually see the pressed wood in between. These tables fool beginners all the time, usually because they do a pretty good job of hiding the pressed wood. Now, why did they use pressed wood to begin with? There's a lot of misconception about it, that it's only in lower end furniture. It's not. It's in a lot of higher end mid-century pieces as well. It was a nice, stable, flat substrate to glue veneer to, and it allowed exotic woods like teak and mahogany to stretch farther. You could get more out of a log if you turn it into veneer than solid wood. This helped keep things affordable for people and avoid some of the issues with solid wood like cracking and stuff like that. Now I could have used something like contact cement to re-adhere this. I've had really good luck with this glue with solid teak. Teak is a bit of an oily wood, so some glues don't hold up very well, but I had really good luck with this one, and this is actually waterproof as well, which I think is important on a dining tabletop. This kind of glue does need to be clamped. I'm opting to use some tape here instead of a clamp just because it's such a long span. I'm gonna tape this up really well, set it aside to dry, and then I can get to work on the underside of the main table. I'm going to make sure to mark where everything is just so when I go to put this back together, I'm not second guessing myself. Every hole has to line up, so this is just a lot easier. Mahogany is a wood that tends to darken over time. You can see the original color of the raw mahogany underneath where that assembly was. Now, looking at this section here, to some, it would appear that this is solid wood, and it's true that it is all wood, but it's not one piece. So we've got teak veneer on the outside, mahogany veneer on the inside, just like the rest of the table. And I'll snap a couple of photos here so you can see it a little bit closer. We've got the mahogany veneer on the inside, solid wood in the middle, different type, and that thin little bit of teak veneer on the outside. And same thing here, just another view, mahogany, solid wood, and the teak on the outside. So that is how thin the veneer is on these pieces, and it's why a lot of beginners kind of don't always have the best luck with them, because it's so easy to sand through the veneer. Now, I mentioned earlier when I was scraping the top of the leaf that the main table had a totally different kind of finish on it. And I think what happened here is that it would have initially had that same sort of Danish oil finish, just fairly thin, but it looks like there are decades of built up furniture polishes, something like pledge or some kind of waxes that just have built up over time, and dirt gets ingrained into them and it starts to look dull, so they add more. And you'll see exactly what I mean when I start to do the tops. Now, on the solid wood trim pieces and the legs, I'm going to do 150 grit. On the veneer, I'm going to use 180. So the middle part of this half of the table, that edge banding was loose as well. But there's another problem. There's only 3 pins and there's 4 holes, so they lost one somewhere along the way. So I'm going to snap a picture and see if I can find a replacement. In the meantime, I will put the rest in and re-glue this strip. Just like the last one, glue on each side and tape it up to clamp it. Once the glue has had time to set on all of these pieces, I pull the tape off and use the scraper to scrape off the glue. Because there's veneer on both sides of this, I don't want to try to sand through it, because 100% I would sand through the veneer. As mentioned, I'm using 180 grit on both the veneer on the bottom and the top. On the bottom here, I'm not going for perfection. I'm literally just doing a really light sanding so that I can seal it properly. I'm not worried about getting every little mark out. The underside of the main table has some glue spillage from where they attached these solid trim pieces to the veneered pieces. It's super brittle, so I just used my scraper to remove any of the excess. No one is ever going to see this. It's just one of those little things that's going to make me happy. What doesn't make me happy is what happened to this top. So, like I said, you can see a huge difference in what I'm scraping off here versus what I was scraping off on that leaf. The finish there was quite dry and powdery, and the finish here, not so much. It's really thick and it's quite physical trying to scrape it off, but look at this. If I take this and squish it together, it stays squished. This is years and years of using waxes and furniture polishes improperly, not cleaning them properly, and it just builds up and builds up. So, I mean, honestly, there's no surprise that this actually had mildew on it. It's going to feel so nice to get all of this gunk off this table. Now, this section looked like it's been cut with a knife. I don't know if they were literally cutting things on it or if some kid was just messing around, but those cut marks are unfortunately right through the veneer, so there's not really much I can do about that. They're not even wide enough to get filler down into them. As the finish comes off, you're starting to see more and more of the damage that I have to deal with. And you can see here, I cleaned it up pretty well. I wanted to give it a test to see just how bad it was going to be. In other words, to see if there was going to be any wax buildup on the sandpaper. And you can see I only sanded this little bit. And if I stop this and bring this a little bit closer, you can actually see the wax build up on the sandpaper just from that little area. Once you get even one of these little spots build up, let alone a whole bunch like there are here, your sandpaper is pretty much useless. I'm going to show you how you can get rid of that and keep using the same sandpaper, but for now I have to do a better job of scraping. There was still a little bit of wax residue. Another thing that can sometimes happen, especially if you're using a finer grit like this, is you'll get areas where the dust will build up. Now, the sandpaper I'm using here isn't made for this machine. The holes don't line up exactly, so I'm getting more buildup than I normally would. But this little block will get rid of wax residue, and it'll help clear away excess sawdust. And this is going to help extend the life of your sandpaper and save you money in the long run. And you'll see me use that block a couple times here as I'm going along. You can see the dust is super fine. And yeah, it just allows me to keep using the same sandpaper a bit longer. This area on the left is where the damage is. You can see there are some water rings and some areas of dark staining, so I'm gonna have to use oxalic acid on these tops. This wouldn't be my first choice because I have a table leaf. Now what happens often with tabletops, where the leaves aren't used that much, the tabletops will fade over time or lighten with certain woods, and the leaf will stay dark. So I'm going to have to use oxalic acid on all 3 pieces, including the leaf, to hopefully try to get these a little bit closer in color. There are rare occasions where I would suggest using oxalic acid only on dark spots. Generally, it has kind of a negative effect and you end up with light patches, so it is recommended that you do it over the whole top. This is hotly contested in the furniture flipping and restoration world. Everyone seems to have their own opinion on that. This is how I learned to do it, and this is how I think it should be done. There's this one corner where the teak is a lot lighter than the rest. Now, obviously natural wood is going to have a lot of different tones and variations, but this one corner is just so much lighter than the rest. So I'm not going to put oxalic acid on that because I don't want to lighten it any further. This is that area that was really cut up. You can see it's minimized a little bit after sanding. Obviously the veneer is so thin I can't sand too much. And the cuts aren't really wide enough to put some filler in, so they're just going to have to be what they are. On the inside here, I just did a very light sanding, similar to the bottoms. I just need to clean them up enough to put some sealer on it. On the outside, I'm taking a little more time, but again, that veneer is super thin, so I'm just doing as little as possible here. The legs, however, are solid wood, so I'm initially hitting them with that 150 grit. The legs didn't have that same weird buildup as the top did, so this was a fairly quick and easy process. Okay, so this is after the oxalic acid has dried, but it's not rinsed yet. You can see it did lighten some things and not others. There's some smear here, don't worry about that, that will wipe right off. Those super light areas initially are still light. I'm going to rinse these off and just see how this is going to look. I've already kind of resigned myself to the fact that this is probably not going to be perfect. Those of you who've been following me for a while know that that's difficult for me. But sometimes with these pieces, especially veneer, that's very thin, that's just kind of the reality. There are quite likely going to be some cuts and dings and marks that remain. Once all 3 sections have been rinsed off and have dried overnight, it's time to sand. My first sanding was with 180, if you remember. I'm going now with 220, and then I'm going to finish up at 320. This grit is going to depend on what you're using for a finish. With the Odie's oil, you can go as high as you want with grit, and you won't have any issue with bonding. So you can see a few marks here still remain. I'm just going to have to get over it. This middle section looks like it should be flipped upside down, but it can't be flipped upside down because of the way that the pins are. And the pins were put in obviously by the manufacturer, and it's how this lines up. If you look closely, you can actually see how the colors kind of alternate, top, bottom, top, bottom. So it was built that way, and I just have to get over it. So if this color looks familiar, it is because it is a leftover stain from one of the last projects I did, that Cortison oak table or whatever it was. I had a little bit left over, so I just added some more super duper everlasting oil and a little bit more solvent, which is going to dilute this a little bit. Now this looks really brown, and it's the same thing that I said with the Cortison oak. It's not going to be that dark when it goes on. So I just did a little test here on the end of one of the legs, and you can see it looks like an aged patinaed teak color. So this is going to be absolutely perfect. The reason I'm opting to use a stain, and this is honestly the first time I've ever stained teak. Normally you don't really have to. If there's any color matching to do, I tend to do it with toners, but in this case, I'm choosing to use this One, because I have it and I don't want it to go to waste, but also it's going to help kind of unite all those different tones together, and I'm hoping it will help camouflage some of the damage that remains on the top. Now this does have Odie's oil in it, but because this is a table, after this has dried for a couple of days, I'm going to go in and use some Odie's oil just by itself on top, just for some added protection, and then I actually end up using another layer on top of that, which is the Odie's wood butter. And together this is going to give this, at least I hope, a beautiful, almost patinaed finish, even though it is a brand new refinish. Now, even though this has pigment in it, it goes on the same way as any other Odies. You put it on, let it sit for a little bit, and then buff it off. The stain mixes that I do, I usually buff off right away. Anywhere that there's just plain Odie's oil, and you can see here I'm putting it on the underside. This is just the plain super duper everlasting oil. This I will leave on for a couple of hours and then come in and buff it all off. Now again, this isn't necessary. You can see that even the manufacturers don't do it. I personally think it looks beautiful, even though no one's going to see it. I know that it is sealed. You know, sometimes with dining tables, people spill stuff. I would hope that everyone is using coasters, but you know, that's not the reality, and sometimes things happen. So the more of this that I can seal up, the better it's going to be. So once that is buffed off, I'm going to go ahead and put this back together. I did clean this mechanism up a little bit, and I added a little bit of lithium grease just to help it slide a bit. It's still a bit stiff, which makes it a little bit tricky for one person to pull it apart, but two people can do it super easily. And these legs had nothing on the bottom, so I'm just adding some plastic caps here just to kind of help slide this around. People could put felt pads on the bottom if they wanted. I just didn't want the teak at the bottom of the legs to get chipped by vacuum or shoes or anything like that. So looking back at the underside, this is what it initially looked like, and this isn't the official glamour shot, but you can see the bottom is absolutely beautiful now. Doesn't really matter to anyone but me, but I think this looks great. So I'm adding that second layer of the Odie's oil on top now. I'm going to let this sit for a little bit and then buff that off as well. And follow that with the Odie's wood butter, which has a little bit of a higher wax content. Right now, all three pieces have the Odie's sitting on it. And yeah, then I just buff it all off. This is a part that a lot of beginners with Odie's oil kind of not mess up on, but they don't sometimes grasp how much buffing it actually is. You have to get all of the excess oil off to have a successful finish. So just a quick recap of some of the tools that I used here. I used my Baco scraper. I used oxalic acid on the top. There were a few little areas I had to patch some holes, and I used this Timbermate wood filler in the color Red Oak actually. This is that block that makes cleaning your sanding discs a lot easier and you can get more out of them. This little tool is great for putting in nails or things that are hard to grip. I used Titebond 3 wood glue where I needed to, and this is the grease that I put on the table mechanism. That stain that I had left over was a mix of Southern Pecan and aged bronze pigments with some Odie's Safer Solvent and a little bit of Super Duper Everlasting Oil. My second layer was just Super Duper Everlasting Oil, and my third layer was the wood butter. There were a few little areas that I had to do really small touch-ups, and I used these Mohawk brush tip markers in the color Honey Maple, Honey Spice, and Light Oak. So overall, I mean, especially considering what I started with, I can say that I'm pleased with how this turned out. Over the moon, maybe not so much, because like I said, there were a few marks that I just couldn't get out. And you'll see them in the reveal, but hopefully I've disguised them enough that it's not immediately apparent. I think it's fairly reasonable to expect vintage pieces to have some of that history that, even when refinished, remains on the piece. Let me know what you guys think down below. As always, thank you so much for watching, enjoy the reveal, and I will see you next time.